Hi, I'm Ken Spiro, and I am a tour guide, historian, rabbi, and author. And I'm going to be your host today for a really unusual and interesting tour of Jerusalem wall to wall. We're going to go through the history of the city, almost 4,000 years, by looking at different pieces of the walls of Jerusalem. So even if you've been here many times, you've probably never done a tour like this. We're going to actually start at the beginning. We're going to go in a chronological order, trying to locate pieces of walls from every period of time in the history of Jerusalem. And Jerusalem has been around a long time. You know, it's interesting, within the name Jerusalem, Yerushalayim is the word shalom, Jerusalem, city of peace. And I sort of sarcastically and cynically sometimes say whoever named Jerusalem city of peace has like a really bad sense of humor, because the city has been conquered and destroyed at least 36 times in its almost 4,000 year history. And since we're in Tisha B'Av, we're going to specifically focus obviously on the Jewish connection to the city and seeing periods of time when Jerusalem was the capital, spiritual and political capital of the Jewish people. But we're going to begin now by going back to the very beginning of the history of Jerusalem, all the way back to the book of Genesis. The only people who are more indigenous to the land of Israel and to the city of Jerusalem than us would be the Canaanites. And if we look in the Bible, in the 5 books of Moses, in Chumash, the word Jerusalem doesn't appear anywhere. The first name used for the city is the city of Shalem. And this goes back to what's called the Middle Bronze period, which is the period of time of Abraham, back to when it was not a Jewish city, when Abraham comes to visit the city. First, in the story of the War of the 4 Kings against the 5 kings, when Abraham goes to rescue his nephew Lot. And later, when he comes back to the city, to the top of the hill, which we'll see later, which is where the famous binding of Isaac story takes place in Genesis chapter 22. But if we go back 3,700 years ago to the Middle Bronze period, the only remains we can find of the original city of Jerusalem in terms of walls are right in back of me over here. What you're looking at is primarily early walls from the First Temple period, which is the Iron Age, but the foundations of much of these walls are built on the Canaanite foundations of the city. Remember, Jerusalem, the land of Israel, before we Jewish people came in the book of Joshua to conquer the land and settle the land, Jerusalem and all the land of Israel were occupied by Canaanites. Canaanites is a generic term used for 7 different groups of people. Hittites and Perizzites. The ones who lived in Jerusalem were called the Jebusites, the Yevusi. And they lived in 31 different city-states, were occupied by these 7 different groups of people who were generically called Canaanites. But here you have the earliest remains of, and the only wall remains that I've been able to locate, of pre-Jewish inhabitation of the city. So it gives you an idea of the size of the city going all the way back 3,700 years ago, when Jerusalem was, again, a non-Jewish city located at the bottom of what is this very long hill called Mount Moriah, at the top of which we'll see later is where the temple will be built. Just to point out while we're here, besides seeing the walls of the city, you can see a columbaria, which is a dovecote, where birds were raised in these little areas here. But in back, if we look to the left, you can see a door carved out of the stone, and that door is actually the burial site. It's an entrance to a First Temple period burial site. And since we know, by the way, the only people allowed to be buried inside the walls of Jerusalem, and this is explicitly stated in the Torah, are the Malchei Yehuda, the kings of Judah, in the site, which unfortunately has been largely chiseled away and turned into a stone quarry at later periods of time in history. But here could well be the remains of the burial sites of all the kings of Judah, including possibly King David, from the First Temple period itself. So we're going to leave this spot now and work our way up the hill through the different periods of time of the history of Jerusalem, getting all the way to the 21st century. So while we're still at the bottom of the city of David, I want to point out what is one of the few areas of Canaanite, pre-Jewish, Middle Bronze period, 3,700-year-old walls of the city is what you see down below us over here. This is not only a piece of a wall, and you can even see the stairs where the wall is. You can see that below our feet was actually a gate. And this could have well been the Watergate. We're not talking about the hotel in Washington, D.C. here. The original Watergate, which is, because we are located right in back of where we're filming, is the Spring of Gihon, which is the original water supply for the city of Jerusalem, which is why the Canaanites built their city at the lower part of the hill to be near that incredible spring that pumps 1,800 cubic meters of water a day. But this is one of the main entrances to the city and a gate that could have been the access to that spring. And what's particularly interesting about this spot is in Genesis chapter 14, which is the first place Jerusalem is mentioned. After Abraham goes to rescue his nephew Lot, he comes back to the city. And it says, Malchi Tzedek melech Shalem hotzi lechem v'yayin v'hu kohen lekel elyon. It says Malchi Tzedek, the king of Shalem, there's the pre-Jerusalem name, brought out bread and wine. He was a priest of God the Most High. Could be that that story actually happened in this place. So we're here still in the city of David in what's called Area G. It's just one of the many excavation sites in the city of David, which, by the way, even though it's been excavated for well over a century, still remains about 85% unexcavated. But this is one of the most well-known sites. You can see the remains here, by the way, of a house destroyed when the first temple was destroyed. This is a fancy upper-class Jewish home built into the side of the hill. Could well be below what was King David's palace, destroyed 2,500 years ago when Nebuchadnezzar, the emperor of Babylon, destroys the first temple. We have some amazing evidence of the destruction found in the site over here. But since we're doing a wall tour, I wanted to point out something that happens later in history. Jerusalem is destroyed for the first time by the Babylonians 2,500 years ago. Jeremiah the prophet says that we're going to go into exile for 70 years, but we're going to return. After 70 years, when now the world power is no longer Babylon, but Persia, the Emperor Cyrus of Persia allows the Jews to return. And they return to a city in ruins. And the Bible describes how Ezra comes to spiritually strengthen and restore the Jewish people. And later Nehemiah will come, and his job will be to reestablish walls around the city so they can fortify and secure the city to enable people to live in it safely and, of course, to rebuild what will then be the Second Temple, Part 1. And if we read in the book of Nehemiah, it says, this is Nehemiah chapter 2, verse 17. So I said to them, you see the bad situation we are in, that Jerusalem is in ruins and gates have been burned in fire. Come and let us build the walls of Jerusalem so that we will no longer be a source of humiliation. So that's when he decides. He walks around at night and he scouts out the city and he prepares the people, the logistics of rebuilding the walls. What we think we have here, if we look up over here, it's hard to see. There's many different periods of wall here. That stepstone structure is 3,700 years old. But in the corner here, right above the stairway, is a piece of the early, what archaeologists believe is the early Second Temple period walls. Nehemiah's walls built when the Jews were returning from Babylon about 2,400 years ago. So we're standing to the south of the old city walls of today, in the intermediate area. This direction, further south where we just were, is the City of David archaeological site. That's the earliest part of the city. That's where the original Canaanite city was established. We saw the pieces of wall that go all the way back to the Middle Bronze period, 3,700 years ago. We know that when the Jewish people entered the land of Israel for 440 years, from the time of Joshua all the way through, so it's Joshua and Judges into the book of Samuel, until King David's time, Jerusalem will be a non-Jewish city in the heart of a Jewish country. And the Ark of the Covenant and the Tabernacle, the Mishkan, will be in 4 different locations in the land of Israel. In Gilgal, Shiloh, Nov, and Givon. But it's during the reign of King David, the second king of the Jewish people, after King Saul. And King David says, he says, now that we have a king from whom all future kings will come, now we need a proper capital city. And since we Jews are not just a religion, but we're also a nation, but we're both, we're an ethno-religion, we pick our capital city for spiritual reasons. And of course, the spiritual reason is Genesis chapter 22, the binding of Isaac's story, where Abraham, who's living down by Mamre near Hebron, is told, God says, take your son, your only son, and offer upon one of the mountains I will show you. And Abraham travels 3 days by donkey. On the 3rd day, he sees the place from afar. And that spot he sees is the upper part of this hill, which is no longer visible today. It's hidden behind all the construction and destruction and reconstruction. You're looking at the southern wall of Herod's Temple Mount, which is 300 meters long, the largest platform ever built on the planet Earth, up above over there. But it's on that site, even further to the north, where the Gold Dome today stands. There's an exposed piece of bedrock, which is the site of the binding of Isaac's story. That is the place where God decides the nexus, the meeting place, between the physical and the metaphysical. And that is the place eventually where David's son, Solomon, Shlomo HaMelech, will build what is called the first temple, which will stand on that site for 410 years. But if we rewind the story, when King David becomes king, he says we need a capital city. He will send his general, Yoab ben Tsuriah, through the water systems that connect the spring of Gihon to the city walls. And he will sneak in and conquer the city and build his city over the original Canaanite city. He will purchase the upper part of the hill, which is up there, from Aravna the Jebusite. Only Jews conquer and buy things in history. He purchased that as the site where the temple will eventually be built, but God does not allow him to actually build that temple. But David will build his palace to the south, at the upper area of what was the original Canaanite city, and the city will expand in Solomon's time up this way. We're standing in the area that's called the Ophel, which is the intermediate area connecting the lowest part of the city of Jerusalem, which is the original Canaanite city and the original Jewish city, with what would be the palaces, the government buildings, and of course at the highest part of the city, which we find in all ancient cities, all temple sites are always built at the highest part, so Jerusalem is no exception to that rule. But up there is where the actual temple stood. But if we look right below us here, we can see excavations primarily done by Elat Mazar in the last few decades. She's been working here up until recently. She's the granddaughter of one of Israel's greatest archaeologists, Benjamin Mazar, who dug in the early years of the state and also dug many important sites after 1967 Six-Day War when Jerusalem was reunified. And what she uncovered here, you can see, are actually fortifications and walls from the First Temple period, at the time when this part of the city was incorporated into the city walls. And again, First Temple period walls are rare to find. Most of this was destroyed or built over. In this site also, she discovered not long ago 2 more of those boule. We talked about the Gemaryahu ben Shaphan boule. She found here a fascinating boule, which is the boule of King Hezekiah, Hizkiyahu HaMelech, who was one of the greatest kings, descendant of King David, who built the water system that's famous in the city of David, and also built the broad wall, which we also are going to visit during our tour. So, and he was a very righteous king, and during his time, he fought off an Assyrian siege of the city, which we'll visit that site later. But his prophet advisor was Yeshayahu, Isaiah, whose book of the Bible is the biggest book in the entire Hebrew Bible. And right near where she found the boule of Hezekiah, that seal of Hezekiah, they found another boule, another seal, which is partially damaged, but it seems to say, it's missing a few letters, Yeshayahu Hanavi, Isaiah the prophet. So not only are we taking the walls and pulling the history out of the ground from the walls, the archaeology itself is making the Bible come alive to us. So we've been doing a lot of filming outside the walls of the old city of Jerusalem of today, but now we're actually inside the walls of the Jewish quarter, looking at below our feet, dropping down about 30 feet below the ground of today, is an incredibly important piece of archaeology. This is called the Broad Wall. And here we are looking at a piece of wall built during the First Temple period. Now this is way after the time of King David building his city over the Canaanite city. Many, many kings later. This is during the reign of King Hezekiah, when Israel's already split into 2 countries, with 10 tribes in the north, Israel, and Judah in the south. And Judah is going to be ruled by 20 different kings. All are descendants of King David. Hezekiah is one of the most righteous kings. Our sources tell us that God even wanted to make him the Messiah. That's how great he was. But it's during Hezekiah's reign. Remember, the northern kingdom, the 10 lost tribes, that story has already happened. A good chunk of the Jewish people have already gone into exile and are disappeared for history. The northern part of the country is no longer a Jewish state. The southern kingdom is still around, and many of the refugees from the northern kingdom have fled to the city of Jerusalem. They're living on the hills, the upper hill, which is today where the Jewish quarter is. outside the walls of the original city of David. It's during this time, about 2,700 years ago, when Assyria is the great world power, that Hezekiah breaks his treaty with the Assyrians. He rebels. And Isaiah is the prophet at the time. And Sennacherib, the Assyrian king, will send a huge army to crush the arrogant Jewish king's revolt. And his army will surround the walls of the city. But before Sennacherib even arrives, Hezekiah knows the city's going to be besieged. So he embarks on two really important building projects to protect the city. One is he expands the walls of Jerusalem to include what is that upper hill to the west of Mount Moriah, which is today the Jewish quarter. He builds a wall called the Broad Wall to include the suburbs within the fortifications of the city, to include all those people living outside the walls and protect them. That's what you see is a teeny section of the wall here, which, while not being a particularly beautiful wall, is 22 feet thick and went up to a height of about 25 feet. The other thing he does is, of course, build the incredible water system, bringing the Gihon spring water supply into a pool inside the city walls as a reservoir. With the water supply intact and safe from siege and the fortifications expanded to protect the inhabitants, the Assyrians come and besiege the city. Isaiah, the prophet, and we already saw the seals that were found of Hezekiah and Isaiah down at the lower part of the city of David in the Ophel area. But Isaiah stands on the wall and says, the city shall not fall. As they came, the Assyrians, they're going to go back that way. And that's exactly what happens. We're told in the Tanakh that a plague hits the Assyrian camp and they flee and the siege is broken and Jerusalem will survive for many years after, until it's finally destroyed by the Babylonians. But here you have remnant of that wall, which is described in the book of Isaiah, in the book of Kings, and in the book of Chronicles. What's even more interesting is in the book of Isaiah, it says, if you read in chapter 22, Isaiah is describing Hezekiah's building projects to protect the city. It says, you counted the houses of Jerusalem, and you demolished the houses to reinforce the wall. You made a reservoir between the two walls by the water of the old pool. He's describing the two major projects that Hezekiah embarks on. And you see them, not only you see it here, but he describes how when you build a wall after the houses are already outside the wall, like you build a highway, you're going to have to destroy some houses. What's most amazing is not only do we find this wall here, which shows us when the Jewish quarter was finally brought within the walls of the old city. But if you look in the corner over there, you can see the corner of several rooms of a house destroyed by Hezekiah's builders when they built the walls of the city. So even that little detail that's recorded in the book of Isaiah, the archaeologists unearth here. It's an incredible correlation between archaeology and the Tanakh and the Bible. Unfortunately, in this particular case, this was a close call with destruction, but we survived this one. Fast forward a number of years later, when we get to the Babylonian Empire, and we've already seen what happens there when the Babylonians, when the last three kings of Judah, the last king being Hezekiah, will rebel, and eventually the city will be destroyed with the first temple by the Babylonians, and the Jews will be taken into exile. Here we have something very interesting. These are the walls of the city, but they're below our feet. They're not visible. And we have a convergence of two periods of time, first and second temple period. You can see the archaeologists did not want to just open this up as a site. They wanted to build on top of it. We're standing on what is the Crusader reconstruction of the Cardo, which was originally a Roman road that became a Byzantine road 1,500 years ago, that became a Crusader road 1,000 years ago. But below the feet there, we see two things. Number one is the red stone here is showing us where the continuation of Hezekiah's broad wall runs. And we find pieces of this wall going all the way up to the Jaffa Gate. So now we know how big the city was at its largest expansion before it was destroyed by the Babylonians 2,500 years ago when the first temple was destroyed. The Jews go into exile. They come back. They rebuild a small city of the second temple in the area of the city of David, or even smaller than that city, but the city will expand. And here we see, this is from 2,700 years ago. This is from about 2,200 years ago. This is mid-Second Temple, Hasmonean, Maccabean period walls you can see of the city on the western side going towards the north, which is that way over here. But if you look down the shaft the archaeologists dug, you can actually see, and I'll point it out with my laser beam over here, you can actually see right here there's a seam right over here. And here you can see on one side of the camera. On the right side, if you're looking at the picture, you'll see this is 2,700 years ago, first temple period wall. And here you can see where during the time of the Maccabees, the Greek occupation of Israel, mid-second temple period, they reused some of the surviving fortifications from the late first temple period into the fortifications of the second temple period. So it's a great, one of the only places you see a meeting between the first and second temple period Jerusalem taking place right below our feet. So we're standing actually below what is the Cardo of today. The original Cardo is a Byzantine period road going back about 1,500 years. It was a major bisecting street that cut the city in half north to south. But Jerusalem is one layer of destruction and reconstructed, built upon itself. And again, when we dug up the city post-1967, the archaeologists didn't just want to dig up the city and make it a huge archaeological site, since we're one of the only ancient people who is still around. I always say we're the oldest, the newest old people on the planet Earth. They basically, a lot of places were dug and either covered up or built over. The broad wall we saw is one of the only places where they actually uncover a site and leave it exposed with nothing built on top of it, because the real estate is just way too valuable to do that in a lot of places. But here, when they dug below what is that Byzantine road from 1,500 years ago, what we find is an entrance to the city from going back to this about 2,000, a little less than 2,200 years ago. This is the time of the Maccabees and Hanukkah. This would be mid-second temple period. We already saw the walls of the city from Nehemiah and the city of David. We saw the extension of the Temple Mount from Herod the Great, which is a later period of time. But here what we're seeing is the entrance on the western side to the city during the time of the Maccabees, which again is valuable to us because it shows us that while the city started out as a teeny second temple city reconstructed during the time of Ezra and Nehemiah by the small number of Jews who had returned from Babylon, once the temple's rebuilt, the city, the population grows and the city itself grows and the walls expand. And here you see exactly that. You see the further expansion of the city back into the area of the Jewish quarter, fortified during the time of the Maccabees and the story of Hanukkah. So we're standing here on the eastern side of the old city. Facing out this way, we have the Mount of Olives. Below us, we have the Kidron Valley, which is historically the eastern border of the city. The city could not expand further eastward because of that valley, which is great natural defenses. And you can see here, by the way, the world's oldest continually used cemetery, which has been a Jewish cemetery for over 3,000 years, destroyed in the 1948 war and then restored after the 1967 war. But what interests us is looking back this way, because what we're looking back over here is we can see the eastern wall of the old city, which is today the eastern wall, and we're looking at the southeast corner of the Temple Mount, right over here. This is Herod's Temple Mount, and this is Jerusalem at its largest expansion in history, far larger than the old city walls we have today. We already saw the early walls built by the Jews, by Nehemiah, when the Jews returned from exile. When the Jews came back from Babylon, there was only a few Jews still living in the city who hadn't been exiled. And when they came back, the city was in ruins, and only a few Jews initially came back. So there was no need to build a large city. The original Second Temple period, the city walls were actually smaller than the First Temple period. But that's a period of 420 years, and once the temple's rebuilt, the city will expand. Just like we see Israel, the population grows dramatically from 1948. The population doubles in the first 6 years. So too, Jerusalem will grow dramatically over several centuries. And the original Second Temple, which was built when the Jews returned from Babylon, will be remodeled and completely rebuilt by the Roman puppet king Herod the Great, who will rule from 37 to 4 BCE. This is the early years of Roman occupation of the land of Israel, and the Romans were the last great occupying power in the Second Temple period. By this time, the city has grown dramatically, and Herod, who was a very complex, interesting, dangerous, but very ambitious guy, wanted to build Jerusalem into a gorgeous city, one of the most beautiful cities in the Roman Empire. So to ingratiate himself with his subjects who hated him, and with the rabbis who he killed mostly, he decided to not only expand the walls of the city, but to rebuild the entire Second Temple into Second Temple Part B, into the largest religious site on the planet Earth. And one of his major building projects, we're seeing the expansion right here. If you look here at the southeast corner of the Temple Mount, you can see a seam in the wall over here. Because to the north, going up this well, while the upper part of the wall is much more recent and Islamic, the lower part of the wall is the upper hill of Mount Moriah, enclosed in a platform from the early Second Temple period. Herod, wishing to make the largest platform on the planet Earth, which is what he does, what the Temple Mount is, will expand the platform. And you can see literally the seam here. So what you have over here are the remains, the lower part of the wall, most of which is not visible, a lot of which is buried behind a Muslim cemetery, of Temple Mount Shlav, as we say, Part A, Part Aleph, okay, the first part of the Temple Mount from the early Second Temple period. What you have from the seam over is the expansion of the platform further south, adding a significantly larger piece of land to the platform, which he does also going to the west and to the north. Behind here is what's called Solomon's Stables, which actually have nothing to do with King Solomon, but they are massive vaults and arches that supported the flooring because Mount Moriah is sloping down this way. So there's a huge hollow space in here, and to keep the Temple Mount level, it had to be supported with arches that the flooring of the Temple Mount were built on top of. So you get a sense of the incredible size and grandeur of what it looked like. You can even see some of the original Herodian stone if you look down, that is still well preserved with the raised center and the recessed frame. Again, when Herod finished building this, and this is Jerusalem at the height of its glory prior to its destruction at the hands of the Romans many decades later, but even the rabbis who hated Herod, and he was so cruel to them and to the Jewish people, when he had finished this construction project, much of which continued after his death, they said, if you haven't seen the house of Herod, you haven't seen a house. And again, it was considered one of the most wonders of the ancient world in terms of religious sites on the planet Earth. So we're standing again at the very southern part, outside the Old City Wall, south of the Temple Mount. And I wanted to point out this piece of wall here, which doesn't look too impressive, is one of the only remains of the Byzantine walls. Now we say Byzantine, we know the Roman Empire will split into an Eastern and Western Roman Empire. The Western Roman Empire will end in 475 of the Common Era, when it's overrun by Germanic peoples. The Eastern Roman Empire in Constantinople will last all the way until the 15th century. That would be the Greek-speaking Roman Empire. And that part of the Greek-speaking Roman Empire, in the later history of the Roman Empire, will be the world power that will dominate the city of Jerusalem. But it's important for another reason. When the Romans will destroy Jerusalem in the year 70, they will level the city, level the walls, level the Temple Mount's upper walls, destroy the citadel at Jaffa Gate, leaving the city basically in ruins and largely unwalled, building a few Roman features into the city. But in the 4th century, Christianity will become the official religion of the Roman Empire under Constantine the Great, who himself, by the way, was never even a Christian. They say he may be converted on his deathbed, but realizing that if he can't beat these guys, join him, he will make it the official religion in 325 of the Common Era. Once the city becomes Christian, its status will change dramatically because of the events in the Christian Bible linked to the story of Jesus' arrest and trial and crucifixion and resurrection, and that's linked to Jerusalem. So the later Byzantine emperors will invest in building many churches in the city and re-walling that city, re-walling the city of Jerusalem. And what you see here is a piece of that wall, which actually included the city of today that is walled, and everything to the south, which is the city of today, which is outside the walls, was in the Byzantine period, which will run from the 4th century until the Islamic conquest in the 17th century. The city will be walled all the way down to here. But during that period of time, and this is hundreds of years after the Second Temple is destroyed and we Jews were exiled on the 9th of Av, during that period of time, the Byzantines will ban us from living in our own city. The Romans had done that at the late Roman Empire, and the ban on Jews living in their city will continue until that time. So sadly, at this period of time, the city will be an important city, very important city for the Christian world, although not their most important city, that will be Rome, but our holiest city will not be accessible to us as the Jewish people. So we're standing at the Jaffa Gate, and we're actually inside the walls of the old city, but at the most significant piece of fortification protecting the city of Jerusalem, which is what you see over here, which today we call David's Citadel. It's a very iconic image that we see of Jerusalem, but we have to appreciate that, of course, number one, it's misnamed. It has nothing to do with King David whatsoever. When King David was king, as we saw at the beginning of the tour, the city of Jerusalem was actually outside the walls of the city of today, occupying the southern part of what's called Mount Moriah. It was actually misnamed by a medieval Muslim historical geographer about 1,000 years ago who had an overactive imagination and was a little short on facts. But the name stuck. But what we really have here is fascinating, especially when we're dealing with all the different periods of time of the history of the construction, reconstruction, and conquest of Jerusalem, because we're looking into a moat. This is actually the northern side of what was Herod the Great, that same King Herod who ruled from 37 to 4 BCE, appointed during the Roman occupation of the land of Israel, the same guy who built Masada and Caesarea and redid the Temple Mount and remodeled the Second Temple. This is the northern side of his palace fortress complex embedded on the western walls of the old city of Jerusalem. And as a matter of fact, if you look into the moat, which was dry, you look a little higher up, you could see the stones in the glacis, this slanted fortification built within the moat, look just like the western wall stones. They have the raised center and the recessed frame. So this is from 2,000 years ago. By the way, when they dug in the moat, further looking to the south, they actually found remains of Hezekiah's broad wall from 2,700 years ago. So we know that Jerusalem in the First Temple period, at its largest point of expansion, actually got up to the upper part of this hill overlooking Gay Ben Hinnom, the Ben Hinnom Valley, which is today the huge valley that is the western border of the now expanded old city of Jerusalem. But if we look up the glacis to the next level, we're going to see what is different looking stone. That is Crusader. Remember, the Crusaders came in 1099. Having pogromed their way through Europe, they surround the city of Jerusalem and capture the city in July of 1099. They will kill about 70,000 Muslims and burn all the Jews they capture in the city alive. They will be the only people, by the way, besides the Jewish people, to have a capital in Jerusalem in the last 3,000 years will be the Crusaders. From 1099 until 1187, this will be the Latin kingdom of the Crusaders. But the upper area you see at the very top was added on by the Ottoman Turks when they completed the walls in 1540. So you literally have from 2,000 years ago until basically 500 years ago, several different major civilizations and the remains left behind. If we go, by the way, to the police station to the south, the Kishlan, go underground 60 feet, we could see the remains of Herod's palace, which was the most significant feature of the old city walls of Jerusalem. So we're here at the Jaffa Gate itself, which is the main entrance today of the old city of Jerusalem. By the way, hundreds of years ago, during the Ottoman period, it was actually the Damascus Gate was the main entrance to the city. You see, by the way, obvious question, if we're talking about walls of the city, why is there a hole over here? This hole is not original. Building a walled city with a big gap is not a great idea. That was made in 1898. The moat that we see running below the citadel used to run to here, and there was a wall that went up to a height of about 6 to 8 feet high, but dropped down to a very deep moat, which was a dry moat. In 1898, before the visit of Kaiser Wilhelm, the Emperor of Germany, whose carriage wouldn't fit through the actual gate over here, and also because they needed better vehicular access to the city, they filled in this part of the moat and they opened it up, and today this is a car road. But the square we're standing in over here is called, and there's a sign on the gate which says over here, the Jaffa Gate itself, which says Omar ibn al-Khattab. Omar ibn al-Khattab is the first Muslim conqueror of Jerusalem, and he will conquer the city. He is the second successor to Muhammad, who's the founder of Islam, and he will conquer the city in 638 of the Common Era. Now, by the way, in the Quran, Jerusalem appears nowhere in the Quran. The whole Islamic connection to the city is something we're not going to go into in this tour, But what is interesting is from the year 638 until the end of 1917, when the British will conquer the city from the Ottoman Turks, who had occupied the city from 1517 for 400 years, the only exception being the Crusades from 1099 to 1187, Jerusalem will be under Islamic control. Now I say Islam doesn't necessarily mean Arab. Most Arabs are Muslims, but today 70% of Muslims are not Arabs. But whether it will be the Umayyads or the Ayyubids or the Abbasids or the Mamelukes, the Seljuks, the Ottomans, they will control all the land of Israel and Jerusalem. Most of that time, this will be a little rotting province, backwater province of different Islamic empires. How many of them will have a capital here? None of them. Their capitals will be in Cairo, Baghdad, Istanbul, or Damascus. Again, the only people to have Jerusalem as its eternal capital city, even when we didn't have a country here, were the Jewish people. So just as we've outlasted all those people who've come here, conquered, and then have disappeared or are in the process of disappearing, we went into exile for 2,000 years, but nonetheless maintained in our hearts that very deep connection to Jerusalem constantly. In back of us, just to point out one more interesting thing, are the two Muslim graves embedded in a building here by the wall. There's much speculation about them. One of the interesting stories, which has never been proven, is that these are the graves of the two architects who designed the wall for Suleiman the Magnificent, the Ottoman Turkish Sultan who built the walls, completed in 1540. As to why they are buried here and if they're actually buried here, no one actually knows, but it's a great story that all the tour guides tell. So we're standing at what is the Zion Gate, which is one of the existing gates of the Old City of today. Today the Old City has basically 8 gates that are open to it, and Zion Gate is the gate that goes to Mount Zion. What I wanted to point out here, and these gates are from the Ottoman Turkish period of time. These are the last walls of the Old City, the newest walls of the Old City. They were completed in 1540. But I wanted to point out the bullet holes in the wall, because this, while not related to the period of time the walls was built, is related to a very important period of time in the history of Jerusalem, which is the 1948 war. We know that in 1948, when the British pull out and Israel declares independence, 5 Arab armies declare war and invade. The Jewish quarter was already sort of under a siege, even while the British were still here. But as soon as the British leave, the Jordanian Legion crosses over its international border and attacks Jerusalem. So the Old City residents are surrounded for 12 days, greatly outnumbered, desperately running short of ammunition. In an attempt to get to them, the Palmach tried to actually break through. The goal was to break through Jaffa Gate, and a diversionary attack was launched against Zion Gate, which was the one gate that the Jewish quarter had access to, the Jewish defenders could get to. Ironically, the attack at Jaffa Gate failed, but the Zion Gate attack actually succeeded. What you're seeing here are all the bullet holes from that war in 1948. It looks like Swiss cheese until today. Unfortunately, we know that despite the fact that the Palmach broke through and got to the Jewish defenders, we now know a decision was made to basically give up the Old City to the Jordanians. So having come back to Israel and finally gotten to independence, we lost the heart of the Jewish state, which is Jerusalem, for 19 years. So from 19 years onward, this was Jordanian territory, and what's in back of me right here, this was no man's land. And the closest you could get to the Old City walls was right over here on Mount Zion itself. So we are standing on the dividing line, as Jerusalem was a divided city between 1948 and the Six-Day War in June of 1967. We finished our tour of the history of Jerusalem by looking at the walls. And I feel it's only appropriate to end in this spot. Now here there is a wall, but it's not an ancient wall of the city. It's a new wall of the city. It's not an outer wall for defense. It's a wall reconstructed when we rebuilt the old city of Jerusalem after 1967 Six-Day War. And we have to appreciate what a singular event that is. No people ever lost their homeland multiple times, went through the longest, most irrational, deepest universal hatred in human history, scattered around the world for thousands of years, outlasting all of the empires that tried to destroy us. And then we come back and reestablish our state after 2,000 years of exile, rebuilding our city, Jerusalem reunified. And we're standing at the center of the Jewish quarter at a place called Batei Machsai Square or Rothschild Square. There's a few important buildings from the 19th century urban renewal projects in a square that, while originally was here before the 1948 war, has largely been rebuilt. And except for those buildings, everything else you're seeing in the square is modern reconstruction of the new Jewish quarter built in the ancient city of Jerusalem, just like we, the Jewish people, one of the oldest surviving people in the world, but now members of one of the newest countries on the planet, like we're the oldest new people. But we are back in our city, Jerusalem rebuilt, and we're standing next to the only quotes put in by the company that was responsible for rebuilding the Jewish quarter, which is a quote from the prophet Hezekiah, who was one of the last prophets of the Hebrew Bible, of Tanakh. And he's writing at the very beginning of the Second Temple when the exiles are starting to return, which is when prophecy ceased. But he's talking about what's going to be in the future. And he says, "Thus says the Lord of hosts, they'll again dwell in the streets of Jerusalem, old men and old women, and old men will walk on their walking sticks for many days, and the streets of Jerusalem will be filled with children playing." And there actually are a few children playing in the square. Usually there's a lot of children playing in the square, because there's 2 schools now based here, and this is basically their playground. But we have to appreciate, we've gone through 3,700 years of Jewish history. And we are back in our ancestral homeland. You know, we saw so many different people. Mark Twain, the great American author, has a quote from it's a fantastic quote. He said, "The Egyptian, the Babylonian, the Persian rose, filled the planet with sound and splendor, then faded to dream stuff and passed away. The Greek and Roman followed and made a vast noise, and they're gone. Other peoples have held their torch high for a time, but they sit in twilight now or vanished." And he says, "The Jews saw them all and beat them all. All things are mortal but the Jew, all other forces pass, but he remains. What is the secret of his immortality?" And it's an incredible quote because we literally outlasted the greatest empires who conquered Israel, conquered us, exiled us, destroyed our city, and now they are either in museums or part of the archaeological display. But Am Yisrael Chai, the Jewish people, we are still here. The city's rebuilt. Yes, we have walls around the city. Yes, Jerusalem was reunified. We have Jewish sovereignty over Jerusalem for the first time in 2,000 years and for 53 years since the 1967 Six-Day War. So we have come so far, accomplished the impossible. We're living proof of the supernatural, and all that remains in terms of the rebuilding of Jerusalem is that final push by the Jewish people so that when Jerusalem is truly rebuilt, and that when we're talking about that, we're talking about the temple. Because as I've mentioned throughout the tour, the temple is not just a building. God is infinite. He doesn't exist within a house. But this is the spiritual power supply of the Jewish people. When we say Ki Mitzion Tetzei Torah, from Zion will come forth Torah, spirituality is supposed to emanate from that temple, through Jerusalem, through the Jewish people, through the world, and we're supposed to fulfill our unique destiny that's talked about by Isaiah so beautifully, to be that nation that's a light to nations in Jerusalem, truly rebuilt as the spiritual center of not just the Jewish people, but of the entire human race. And we should merit to see that final chapter, not just in Jewish history, but in human history, the redemption of the Jewish people and the redemption of mankind soon and in our days. And thank you very much for joining us on this amazing journey.